sending more than 1 million people to internment camps, and denying basic liberties through religious persecution, forced sterilization, and other human rights abuses. The Chinese government operates an extensive system of forced labor to produce key manufactured products, including textiles and electronics. Research has shown that the products of this forced labor system are deeply embedded in global supply chains. For example, this one region is responsible for over 85% of China's cotton production and around 20% of the global cotton supply. Nearly 2 years ago, Republicans and Democrats in Congress worked together and passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. This law recognized the reality that any imports produced in Xinjiang or by entities with close ties to forced labor in the region should be presumed to be made with forced labor and banned from entry until proven otherwise. The Department of Homeland Security enforces UFLPA through U.S. Customs and Border Protection's inspections of cargo entering the United States and through the department's leadership of the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. The FLETF is responsible for publishing a list of entities that the U.S. government determines to be complicit in the CCP's system of forced labor in Xinjiang. The UFLPA is a significant bipartisan measure to counter the CCP's unjust and predatory exploitation of forced labor, but a law is only as good as its enforcement. 16 months after the UFLPA went into effect, the evidence shows that goods made with forced labor in Xinjiang continue to enter the U.S. homeland. Earlier this year, CBP conducted isotopic testing on clothing samples and found that 15% of the items tested positive for cotton from Xinjiang. Meanwhile, even though 2022 U.S. textile and apparel imports totaled $153.2 billion under UFLPA, CBP only detained less than 1,000 shipments worth $39 million from June 2022 to the present in the textile and apparel sector, and of those detentions, only $8 million worth were denied entry. The department needs to take a more proactive approach to enforcing the UFLPA. For starters, the department has been slow to expand the UFLPA entity list, adding only 7 entities to the list in the past year. Additionally, CBP should significantly expand its use of isotopic testing and other supply chain tracing technologies to identify cotton sourced from Xinjiang, as well as for other trade enforcement issues. Small, low-value de minimis shipments also pose a growing obstacle to CBP's enforcement capabilities, undermining CBP's ability to interdict not just goods made with Uyghur forced labor, but also narcotics, such as fentanyl. Shippers of de minimis goods face less CBP scrutiny and can ship directly to consumers. More than 60% of de minimis shipments come from China, including from direct-to-consumer clothing retailers that face scrutiny over their supply chain's risk of using forced labor in Xinjiang. De minimis shipments have doubled in the past 5 years alone, rising from $500 million in fiscal year 2019 to over $1 billion in the past year. And that appears on the chart that is erected behind me. Acting CBP Commissioner Troy Miller admitted just last month that the record volume of de minimis shipments makes, quote, screening these shipments and ferreting out contraband incredibly challenging, end quote. With such a flood of less scrutinized shipments arriving at U.S. ports of entry every day, the openings for banned imports and smuggled drugs to slip through CBP inspection are plentiful. And this raises a question of the design of the relevant statute. The exploitation of Uyghur forced labor enriches Chinese industry at the expense of American manufacturers and workers. The domestic textile industry is critical for supplying equipment and clothing to our military and hospitals, as well as to our population. Rigorous enforcement of the UFLPA counters China's predatory trade practices and supports American manufacturers while keeping the CCP's forced labor system in Xinjiang from profiting off access to the U.S. market. This is an important issue that warrants congressional attention as we carry out our responsibility to ensure that the laws passed by Congress enjoy robust and effective enforcement by federal agencies. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing. I appreciate the fact that you did this. Just in my review and preparation for this hearing myself, it appears that additional oversight is going to be important here. In reviewing the statute, I saw that there are many reports that are generated or required to be generated by the statute, but I don't know that either they are being generated or we're reviewing them as closely as we should. And I think this is a big step in the right direction, so I greatly appreciate that. I want to apologize to the witnesses for the light turnout here in the hearing room today. As you may know, the House is a little distracted with some internal matters, but I assure you it doesn't reflect on the importance of the matter that we're here to hear your testimony about. I wanted to talk in a couple of tranches here. One is with respect to the Uyghurs, but I also have an interest in some of the issues that are going on in Africa, although I believe there's some links there as well with respect to forced labor. The goods might be a little bit different, but I think the moral issue and the economic issue is very similar, and the need for the United States to step in and address it, whether it's in China or Africa or wherever, is important as well. With respect to this issue, just in reviewing the statute, there's a couple things that I wanted to raise, and I'll have a chance to ask you some questions about it, but I'll just flag it now. The first is, as the chairman mentioned, I don't know if there's many prosecutions of these cases going as one might expect, or the interceptions. I've got a criminal prosecution background, so I might have a little bit of a different perspective. You all might need to give me some guidance on that, but it does appear that there have been interceptions of shipments where forced labor goods have been included in those, and the new testing methods, I think, have reflected that to some extent. But I do wonder about next steps, whether there's an effort or the ability, frankly, to take it beyond that point with respect to sanctions. Just in reviewing the sanctions section here, there's language about asset blocking, for example. And I did notice that there are shipments that can be sent back, I suppose, or not allowed into the country. But I wasn't clear on whether we had the ability to actually seize and forfeit what was shipped over, because it would seem to me that if we really want to send a message that this is unacceptable, seizure is the way to do it, as opposed to just sending it off to some other place where they can then still make money off the illegal goods. Secondly, I know there's issues about the definitions that allow companies or allow the United States to put some of these companies on the list where they get the rebuttable presumption and making determination about whether this specific company is going to get the kind of extra oversight that it should based on where these goods are coming from. And I thought that was important in two ways. One is the de minimis issue that the chairman just raised. If we are seeing shipments, and again, this might be my limited understanding of how this is working, but if I believe it's an $800 cutoff. If we're seeing multiple items that are falling under the $800 amount, and I recognize that there's a limit, I'll come to this in a moment, limited enforcement capability just from boots on the ground with respect to funding that the government has on this front. But if we're finding multiple examples of these de minimis items, is there a way to aggregate those so that we can still pursue sanctions against these companies that are shipping it? If not, and I believe also the de minimis number was raised from 200 to 800, and I understand why. There's a limit to how much can be inspected and the like, just sheer manpower, but that might also mean that if there's individual shipping, like especially by, say, email ordering or electronic requests, that there's a way to circumvent the law that was put in place simply by just sending it in smaller amounts. So if that's a correct reading, I'd like to get your thoughts on how we can address that. With respect to the manpower issue, we've gotten a letter from the National Treasury Employees Union, Doreen Greenwald, who's the national president, sent it, and I'd like to make this part of the record if, without objection.
Without objection, so ordered.
And this raises issues about staffing, frankly. And the issue here is, I'll just read a couple of it, and we can come back to this when we get to the questioning. But that the increase in trade has been significant. I'll just read this paragraph. Despite the significant investment in forced labor trade intervention, prevention, and enforcement, the number of CBP's non-uniform trade personnel has not materially increased since CBP was established in 2003, even though inbound trade volume multiplied 32 times between FY 2003 and FY 2023. I wanted to get a sense of, and this might not be, your inside information. We might have to ask the CBP about it, but is that what you're seeing? Are they understaffed? Are there things that we need to do as Congress to provide additional resources so that they have the bodies to do the work? And then with respect to the process, I noticed here there's a forced labor enforcement task force, and this is the group that's tasked with sending the reports to Congress, I think, and making determinations about who goes on this entity list is my sense of it. And I was kind of wondering because we're hearing that might be too many cooks in the kitchen, I guess is a way to put it. Normally in criminal prosecution, you have the people that do the investigation work, and they bring it to the prosecutors who then make a decision about whether there's enough evidence to move forward or not. Doing this by a committee of 7 might be a little large. And also I'm worried that if there are too many people making this determination, maybe we're getting fewer enforcement actions than we should. And I say that in part because I see this rebuttable presumption language that's in the statute, which one would think would make it much easier to pursue these sorts of enforcement actions than in a typical court circumstance. Normally, the government would have the burden of showing that you had materials in here that had slave labor included. But at least in this particular context, there seems to be a rebuttable presumption that shifts the burden to the people who are sending the items here to the United States. And it seems like that would be a heavy burden to me that could only be overcome by clear and convincing evidence. If that's the case, I'd like to get your sense of why we're not seeing more enforcement actions. Is it the structure that we put in place? Is it the staffing issue, or is there something else going on? And then let me move on. I appreciate your indulgence, giving me the time to get through these issues.
I'm looking at the clock.
Okay, I appreciate it. The Democratic Republic of Congo, and I apologize, I know this isn't necessarily what you came to talk about, but just in other hearings I've participated in, I know that they've got an issue with respect to forced labor too. It appears to be elements that are going into batteries, for example, or other high-tech materials, but a lot of the structure sounds similar to what may be going on with what we're told has been going on with the Uyghurs. Individuals who have been forced into labor, essentially enslaved. In some instances, they're getting paid, but not much. Dangerous working conditions, because, for example, when they're mining cobalt, children, that's right, some as young as 6. So there's, and I'll make articles available for that record too. But it struck me as sort of 2 pieces that I wanted to raise with this particular group. One is that this links back to China. Apparently China owns a lot of these mines that are in these African countries that are using the slave labor there. And so it made me wonder, is there ability for China to circumvent the structure that was put in place with this statute just by, offshoring it, basically? And then the other issue I was wondering about is the statute speaks specifically about the Uyghurs. And I know that there are other laws that govern other countries, but I don't know if they are as aggressive as this one, frankly, and as far-reaching. So my question on that front would be, does Congress need to do more to address this type of activity across the board. Not that we want to, neglect what's going on with the Uyghurs in China, but if there are other issues of this going on in other countries, we need to address, for the reasons the chairman mentioned, in the same way. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to give the opening statement. I look forward to your testimony.
I thank the ranking member for his careful preparation and interest in the issue, and even the expanded sort of notion of what this subcommittee ought to be looking at. I also welcome Ms. Ramirez, and I'll say that other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may resume your seats. And I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Ms. Kimberly Glass is the President and CEO of the National Council of Textile Organizations. She is also a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Mr. Peter Mattis currently serves as president of the Jamestown Foundation and is a former Senate-appointed staff director of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. Ms. Louisa Grieve, is that how I pronounce your name? Grieva. Ms. Louisa Grieva is the Director of Global Advocacy for the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Mr. Michael Stumo is the CEO of the Coalition for a Prosperous America, an organization which represents domestic producers and workers across the U.S. economy. I thank all the witnesses for being here. I now recognize Ms. Kimberly Glass for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify at this critical hearing on behalf of the U.S. textile industry and its 540,000 workers across our supply chain. The U.S. industry and our regional allies have been a direct victim of aggressive predatory trade practices by China, costing millions of jobs and making once bustling towns across the United States a graveyard of factories. Our industry are survivors, thrivers, innovators, sustainability chiefs, and we are a strategic supply chain making life-saving PPE when the country needed it the most, and a proud supplier of 8,000 different products to our U.S. military. Today, our industry is facing unparalleled demand destruction as a direct result of negative market forces exacerbated by anemic customs and trade law enforcement. Chinese cotton from Xinjiang is flooding the global marketplace, making its way onto our doorsteps and into our closets. As a result, American textile plants have been forced to idle equipment, lay off workers, while some companies have been put out of business entirely. We need urgent action and attention, and we appreciate this hearing today. 20% of the world's cotton is grown in Xinjiang, made with forced labor. 72% of all Chinese cotton apparel or textiles utilizes Xinjiang cotton. This banned cotton is also a major source of inputs throughout Asia's textile and apparel supply chain, much ultimately destined for the U.S. marketplace. So how much of this banned cotton is being stopped? U.S. imports of textile, apparel, and footwear in 2022 totaled $184 billion, but only $39 million in shipments were detained for possible UFLPA violations over the last 15 months. To put it in context, that's a mere 0.2 percentage point of total imports. Shockingly, despite cotton production increasing in Xinjiang since UFLPA became enacted, enforcement for textile has actually decreased over the last year, both for UFLPA and in our free trade agreement countries where the Chinese are trying to hide some of their cotton. We advertise these figures on the CBP website. You may as well put up a billboard to China and the trade cheaters that say, "Come on in, we aren't really looking." De minimis, I'd rename this the forced labor U.S. job destroyer black market, we don't really look superhighway. Once used exclusively by U.S. travelers bringing personal items home from abroad, the de minimis provision has been weaponized by Chinese e-commerce and other sites to send 3 million packages to the U.S. each day, and it's estimated half of these packages are textile and apparel. These packages bypass inspections, duties, and penalties. De minimis means minimal inspection. In 2016, we had 150 million of these packages. Today, we are on record for 1 billion individual packages containing forced labor goods, counterfeits, fentanyl, largely uninspected, and receiving VIP express treatment, making de minimis the world's greatest black market, and astonishingly legalized by the US government to offshore our industries. 1 billion packages are not de minimis to US manufacturers, US workers, retailers, and our free trade agreement partners who are being displaced from the US marketplace. UFLPA is impossible to enforce with this loophole. When a fire is out of control, you don't look for more data to In terms of our recommendations, Congress must get aggressive on oversight of customs enforcement. You must bring up CBP officials and ask them the hard questions. Ask them for the metrics. Ask them to put out a public roadmap on stepped-up enforcement activities so everyone in the world understands we're taking an aggressive posture related to this. We also have to step up our penalties. We have to close the de minimis loophole. There are tools in the toolbox right now that the administration has through executive authorities and rulemakings to close the de minimis loophole. We need to ask, why aren't you? Congress needs to work on a long-term solution on de minimis, but we can stop the bleeding right now. And we need to utilize the UFLPA entity list for more robustly to deter this fraudulent, illegal trade. In closing, American manufacturers, and especially the American textile industry, competes against Chinese companies, Chinese government, and unfortunately, our own government when we fail to effectively enforce our US trade law. Who in our government would vote to allow China to ship billions each year uninspected, duty-free to the United States? What a gift. Who would condone the packaging and exporting of dangerous products to our marketplace, including products like fentanyl? Who would approve of the flooding of our market with subsidized products, often made with forced labor? Yet that is the de facto policy of the US government when we take a weak posture towards customs enforcement. An aggressive enforcement plan coupled with a set of rational revisions to the outdated and now extremely dangerous loopholes in our trade law would prevent the discontinuation of this devastation. But Congress and the executive branch need to act now. I thank you for the committee's leadership on these incredibly important issues, and our industry depends on these solutions.
Thank you, Ms. Glass. I now recognize Mr. Peter Mattis for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop, and thank you, Ranking Member Ivey, for your time and attention to this issue. It's almost 3 years since the Congressional Executive Commission on China held a hearing on what was taking place in Xinjiang and the Uyghur genocide and the forced labor issue. And here we are today discussing the implementation of what was a very long process to get legislation introduced and passed. And thank you for your time and attention to this and to the question of oversight. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was designed to help address part of the genocide being committed by the People's Republic of China, ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. Forced labor contributes to this genocide by reducing and diluting the Uyghur population in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, dispersing families, and as Nicole Kokoler of the Holocaust Museum pointed out, separating Uyghur men and women and keeping them apart for extended periods of time. The rebuttable presumption is the core of this bill, and it has two parts. The first was drawing a line around the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, recognizing that if you can't get in and look and inspect, then you can't have any confidence about what is being done. And US companies started reporting to the US government and later to the US Congress as early as the spring and summer of 2018 that their inspectors were being detained and not being given access to facilities there. But the core part of another piece of this was going after the participants in the labor transfer programs. Because if we just drew a line around the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, we would have inadvertently created an incentive for Beijing to accelerate its genocide and to further depopulate the Uyghur region by moving them out of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. You had to have both parts of this to work in tandem. And the lion's share of this burden was handed to the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force created by the USMCA agreement, the FLETF. And to date, I think you can notice that there have been 27 entities plus their subsidiaries put on this. But similar to the points that Ms. Glass made about the de minimis loophole and the gap between sort of the universe of what could be and the universe of what actually is inspected is similar in this case. A research group at Sheffield Hallam University led by Laura Murphy identified at least 55,000 entities that could be put onto the entity list, and yet we have 27. How much is being missed? How many in the de minimis shipments? How many in the cotton? How many in all of the other materials that have not yet necessarily been prioritized? You know, CBP is starting to look at PVC pipes, but what about rayon? What about apparel products that don't have any cotton in them? What else is there? Because as CEC uncovered and as researchers affiliated with Louisa Griva's organization have found, there is a full range of consumer products. It's not just apparel. It's in polysilicon. It's in electronics. It could very well be in your iPhone or any other sort of mobile phone that you carry. So if we don't make the entity list part of this, we're simply not taking care of the intent of the law, and we are creating bad incentives or perverse incentives that we wanted to work against. So to this end, I think we need to be thinking about what are ways in which the process can be eased and smoothed out. So as Mr. Ivey noted, it's possible that there's too much of a process within the FLEDF, that it's an interagency process to get to yes, rather than an interagency process to stop nominations. And I think we should assume that US government departments that would nominate an organization for inclusion on the entity list are going to do their due diligence and are responsible stewards of public trust. So to that end, I think any FLEDF member that would nominated an organization for inclusion on the entity list or labor transfer program, that it should be approved and added to the entity list within 14 days unless there is convincing evidence to refute that nomination. Any other US government department should have the power to make that nomination, but it should probably have a longer timeline, say 30 to 60 days. NGOs also can help, but I don't think you can have that kind of automatic inclusion. But the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act explicitly notes the role that NGOs have in providing information to the US government to better enforce this law. Second, I know that this is not necessarily Homeland Security jurisdiction, but it's worth keeping in mind because you mentioned the sanctions piece. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act modified the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act to add forced labor as a concern. But to date, just like all the other aspects of UHRPA, there have been no sanctions that have been provided under this. And it seems like this would be a tool that would be useful even where entity lists or withhold release orders may not work. And lastly, I'll just say that there seems to be an issue with China competence across the US government. And if DHS researchers are trying to use Google Translate to hunt down things related to these entity listings, we've got to do a better job, and we've got to think about the resourcing, whether it is in terms of both government capability and the support for this competency in the private sector that can be brought to support these concerns. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mattis. I now recognize Ms. Griva for 5 minutes for her opening statement. Did I get that right this time?
Oh, thank you both so much for the opportunity to testify. The passage of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in December 2021 was truly occasion for hope for Uyghur Americans and for the Uyghur diaspora more broadly around the world, that there was actual economic leverage being brought to bear to address one aspect of the genocide consuming their people. I want to emphasize the incremental nature of the implementation of this bill. The law required a strategy to be published after 6 months. This is a relatively fast and short turnaround time to provide a strategy for a complicated set of enforcement that is different from previous methods of enforcing the import ban under US law. Several of the things that are coming along step by step, including adding additional targeted sectors from cotton, tomatoes, and polysilicon to include as well, all kinds of minerals, including the cobalt and the lithium that are required for the renewables. And just last week, we have two entirely new sectors identified by NGO reporting. C4ADS issued a report on all mining in Xinjiang, in the Xinjiang region, which implicated, through ownership and trade ties, over 200 global corporations, and including publicly traded companies that are traded in our own retiree funds. And the last one is seafood. So let me give you the headline. It's a bit shocking. The name of the report is "The Uyghurs Forced to Process the World's Fish." The report from the Ocean Outlaw Project found that Uyghurs subjected to forced labor in the processing plants on land are processing, quote, much of the seafood sent to America and Europe. And this includes fish that may be advertised as local catch, but then it's processed in China and then sent back out. Extremely concerning. Other sectors include luxury vinyl flooring, automotive, and the list goes on. This does take time to implement, but there is a partnership, not only as contemplated in the law, but in CBP and FLEDF's own outreach to CSOs. There is a clear commitment to receive information from the public, from researchers such as Dr. Laura Murphy. There's a dedicated email address, which I have to say is not very normal in my experience with government agencies. So that we all need to take advantage of that, and then we need CBP and FLEDF to do their part to process the information. I do believe there's a capacity issue with Chinese language ability and staffing. Transparency is something that has been improving and needs further oversight and encouragement to continue. There is now a UFLPA data dashboard. It contains information about the shipments stopped, and this didn't used to exist at all. So thanks to global concern about Uyghurs, an NGO and congressional concern, this transparency is much stronger with this data dashboard. Let me move to de minimis as a huge black hole. I would suggest that the solution to ensure that if the amount cannot be lowered, if there is resistance because of the intention to ease normal trade, at a minimum, Congress should ensure that countries where there is a high risk of forced labor, especially state-imposed forced labor, it's a state policy. That entire country needs to realize that their business interests will be hurt because they will not have access to this no tariff and low inspection channel. And there are bills, there's a Senate bill, and there's also a bicameral bill called the Import Security and Fairness Act, which will do just that. I'd also like to recommend that Congress press CBP on greater transparency on non-ocean shipping. People may not be aware that shipments into the U.S. through rail, road, and air are not provided to the public in the same way. Ocean shipping manifests are provided, and then we have private sector data aggregators that put that information up, and then NGOs and market competitors in the American market can see where the shipments are coming and provide e-allegations and give tips to the government about where there may be violations of forced labor import ban. And that's totally missing for air, road, and rail. We've already talked about the entity list. Certainly this is urgent. And then finally, penalties. We are unaware of any penalties being imposed for any importer that is knowingly benefiting or providing false information to CBP in rebutting the presumption of forced labor, and it's urgent. Any law that is seriously being enforced should also come with penalties for violators. And then finally, we have a real issue with the re-exports. We need data on what re-exports are happening after a detention, inspection, and then denial of entry. And we also need active diplomacy, which is in Section 4 of the law, that involves more than one entity, not just the State Department, but also our enforcement agencies, to make sure that other countries don't become the dumping ground for Uyghur forced labor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Grieth. I now recognize Mr. Michael Stumo. Is that how you pronounce your name, sir? Stumo?
Yes, sir.
Stumo for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Ivey, and honorable members, my name is Michael Stumo. I'm the CEO of the Coalition for a Prosperous America, CPA is proud to be the nation's leading bipartisan organization representing exclusively domestic producers and workers across many industries. I appreciate the testimony of my fellow panelists. I largely agree. I'm going to supplement in a little different way. This committee has been rightly worried about narcotics coming through the southern border, but I will focus on the forced labor goods, the narcotics, and the contraband that comes into our mailboxes through the de minimis loophole. CBP said this regarding de minimis, quote, illicit opioids can now be purchased online from the comfort of one's home. Opioids entering the country through express consignment or international mail have a substantial higher purity level than the opioids entering the southwest border, end quote. On a typical day, 26,000 customs officers admit 107,000 goods shipments through normal entry. These entries have paperwork prepared by licensed customs brokers who are responsible for maintaining the integrity of our ports and complying with over 500 laws governing merchandise entry. But thanks to the de minimis loophole, an additional 2 to 3 million shipments per day enter our ports. These shipments arrive by mail and express shipper without sufficient data, without inspection, or a broker's involvement. They are overwhelming our customs officers. De minimis has been weaponized by our adversaries abroad, including China, and exploited by transnational criminal organizations. Express shippers and a handful of e-commerce platforms that profit from it are the primary defenders. Whether an express shipper or a customs broker has the right to import is crucial. Customs brokers are, as CBP says, trained and licensed, quote, to act as force multipliers in combating fraud and other schemes against the government, end quote. Customs brokers have a duty to know their customer and to know what is in the imported package on ships, trucks, and airplanes. If they facilitate imports that contain fentanyl or other unlawful goods, they can lose their license and their livelihood. Express shippers and postal services, on the other hand, just pick up sealed packages with addresses and information filled out by China Post, regular citizens, or criminal organizations. De minimis was originally a rational administrative exception. It allowed customs officers to waive low-value mailed gifts or knickknacks purchased by travelers. But in 1994, Customs changed its de minimis rules to eliminate the need for a broker for the commercial shipments. Now, if China Post, for example, merely declares the value as less than $800 in China, not here, it is de minimis eligible. This allows consignees like FedEx, DHL, U.S. Postal Service, and express shippers to import merchandise without inspection or a trained broker. 30 years later, the result has been a massive, lawless disaster that destroys U.S. businesses, enriches forced labor purveyors, and enables undetected delivery of the most potent fentanyl shipments. Criminal organizations and citizens can and do order contraband, including fentanyl, online, then sit back and wait for the postman or the UPS delivery woman to deliver the package to their door from Mexico or China. According to the State Department, most shipments originate in China with suppliers who use international mail consolidators to mask the origin of the shipments. Most US-based traffickers utilize invalid addresses, relying on the large volume of e-commerce parcels from China as a means of concealment. Congress rightly passed the UFLPA to address forced labor Chinese goods. There are improvements that Congress should make to the act, which I cover in detail in my written testimony. But the de minimis loophole makes a mockery of the act. China's Shein and Temu have built enormous businesses around de minimis. Their fast fashion goods are rife with forced labor cotton and other materials, but not inspected. The sheer volume of Shein and Temu goods are forcing U.S. stores and textile companies to close or lay off employees right now. Tellingly, Shein and Temu do not sell any goods in China. The problem will get worse. TikTok is now launching its own e-commerce platform. The de minimis loophole is ungovernable lawlessness. My organization estimates 188 billion de minimis goods came in last year. Some say we just need a bit more shipment data. That has been tried and failed. It will always fail. No country uses de minimis like we do, and many effectively ban it. De minimis should be ended or dramatically restricted. China should be barred. The Biden administration can fix this with executive action, and Congress can do so with legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stumo. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Ms. Glass, I'll begin with you. In my home state, North Carolina, we have the largest textile mill industry in the nation, driven by a skilled workforce and innovative research. Can you describe the impact of failing to prevent imports linked to forced labor in China that it has on the U.S. textile manufacturers?
Thank you, Congressman Bishop, and thank you so much for your support for our industry and your opening comments. I can't tell you how consequential the textile industry is to the state of North Carolina and rural communities across the United States. It is a strategic supply chain because of the products you noted in your opening statement that we make. 80% of what we make in North Carolina in terms of yarn spinning is then sent to places like Central America, made into a finished garment, and coming back, free trade agreements, having to comply with labor and environmental standards. If you talk to anyone in our industry right now, they will say they are running at 50% capacity. So it is not just economic market forces that are impacting the most innovative, resilient, automated industry in the world, but it's also impacting 1.5 million workers in our Western Hemisphere, exacerbating the migration crisis. Yet the statistics that I talked about, and you know I'm fired up about this issue, the statistics I talked about on the CBP website advertises to the Chinese and the world, guess what? We're not doing much here. We have had a very simple ask, and we're asking this committee, please help our industry. This is an immediate crisis. This is not just about the state of North Carolina. This is about the very supply chains just years ago when nurses were wearing garbage bags came to the forefront of helping in a crisis. And textile mills are the only tax base in a community. When it comes away, there's no new jobs that come overnight.
Absolutely.
And so it requires a lot of oversight over CBP to ask some of the hard questions we're asking, and to ask the administration if you can stop the bleeding by putting out a public roadmap, helping increase penalties and inspections, showing our industry that we're fighting for them at this point in time is what's necessary, and we must close the de minimis loophole.
The numbers are striking. I think this, is a matter of enforcing trade law for the American people. The notion that American producers should be required to compete against slave labor from a denier of human rights abroad is the easiest thing for American consumers and voters to understand, and I think they entirely support enforcement efforts against it. The numbers that I thought of interest, there was this article, before I lose my time, I want to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a recent Reuters article titled "U.S. Customs Finds Garments Made with Banned Chinese Cotton," and without objection, so ordered. It talked about in these enforcement or testing occasions, 3 batches of footwear on December 2022, April 2023, May 2023, and on average, the amounts there were as much as 15%, but on some occasions 23% when they do isotopic testing. Tell me about isotopic testing and why is it not being used more widely?
That's a fantastic question. We're asking that question. So Congress, bipartisan support for this topic and bipartisan support for investing in UFLPA. As part of the appropriation, set aside $101 million for UFLPA enforcement, not just for textiles, but all the goods that we were talking about on this panel today and beyond. So far, according to that Reuters article, and please note, Chairman, that was released as part of a FOIA request that our industry has not seen. But according to the Reuters article, it said they've only utilized $1.3 million on isotopic testing. Where's this money going and why? Textile and apparel is one of the primary forced labor products coming out of Xinjiang. Xinjiang production of cotton has grown. We have the ability, Congressman, just so you understand the process, isotopic testing, basically, you can send a product to a lab, you can take a few of the articles out of a particular shipment, send it to a lab and determine, we have the analysis to determine where is that cotton grown. And so a lot of the U.S. yarn and the products coming out of our Western Hemisphere uses U.S. cotton grown across 18 states. We have this technology. This is not hard. We just need to utilize it more in order to determine and deter the trade and publicly tell people these are the folks who are violating it. You will never deter the trade if you're not stepping up your enforcement activities.
And you talk about de minimis, I mean, we'll come back to that. My time's expired, but I would just comment before passing it on to the ranking member that what's de minimis is the use of this isotopic testing and maybe other interdiction means, but it just doesn't make sense. My understanding is that's been resourced. I think we need to know from CBP why it's not being more widely used. And now I recognize
De minimis issue, because I did want to have a follow-up with Mr. Stumo. I think you suggested eliminating de minimis entirely.
Number one, go back to pre-1994 where merchandise imports use a customs broker. So don't let consignees bring in de minimis. So that's the most important part.
Okay. Would
And
that,
secondly, if you have very risky goods like apparel or risky countries like China, which 90% of our counterfeits, 80 to 90% of our counterfeits come through, they're ineligible. But Canada doesn't let de minimis come in through Canada Post. The EU, with their VAT de minimis, they tried to go down to like $10, I think, for VAT de minimis, and they had tons of cell phones allegedly coming through at $8. And you know, and so they just shut it down to zero. I just talked to Mexican Retail Federation; they want to shut it down. So this is, you know, the broker, the consignees should be shipping. They can't enforce 500 different trade laws.
well, let me follow up on that. So with respect to, you're just take it down, not from 800 to back to 200, but just take it to zero, is what you're suggesting.
Well, you know, we can still bring in the knickknacks and the snow globes from overseas and let grandma send us a book. But for this to be a major commercial channel, you're gonna ease so much burden from CBP by redirecting these goods right through normal entry where they have to file the paperwork, the customs brokers do it, just like they used to.
All right, so you wouldn't need additional CBP staff?
Well, I can't guarantee you wouldn't need additional.
Well, I mean, but that's what I'm
You wouldn't
trying
have
to-
3 million. You'd have
Okay, but that
ease the burden a lot.
What I'm trying to get at, though, is, you know, what do we need to do to get it there? So I appreciate your point about eliminate de minimis, but in order for us to actually make that real, we need to know if there are additional resources going to be required. That's all I'm trying to
I'd
get
be
at.
supportive of additional resources, yeah.
Okay.
The law-
And then, Ms. Glass, with respect to the isotopic testing, because I remember certain types of testing for, you know, cases that I handled before. How long does it take to do the testing, and, you know, what does it entail?
Based on my analysis with industry, it can take 3 to 4 weeks maybe, can be expedited. It's not a super involved test. It just requires, does the lab have time to actually run the testing?
Fair enough, fair
meaning
enough. So
you would
with
get
respect to a particular shipment, I apologize about cutting you off, but I
Yeah.
only get 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So a shipment would come in, because I think part of what happened with these rules all happened before I got here, but you had people who were trying to ship goods into the United States, and they were worried about how long it took and how much it cost and how it delayed those activities. So are you suggesting that the way this would work is they would do samples, they would test all of it? What are you proposing?
What they're doing right now, based on the $1.3 million that they have tested, they've tested small batches of goods that they have apparently CBP determined has a higher risk of Xinjiang cotton. So this is not a very difficult test. In fact, a lot in the private industry are using the test just to ensure that their supply chains are transparent and making sure that they are not sourcing Xinjiang cotton by certain importers. But others are just using the free flow of de minimis to get the products in because they know these are largely uninspected. Other reporters, like Sheridan Prasso from Bloomberg, did a report that tested various Shein products she bought off the website, since it's essentially a de minimis company. And all of them, practically all of them, tested positive for Xinjiang cotton.
Okay, so with your organization represents a group of textile companies, I take it?
Yes.
Okay, and so to the extent there were delays that were created by this process, if we add this in, your organizations, your association members would be supportive of that, because I'm sure there are other businesses that would be complaining about it. You'd stand up and say, this is something the United States needs to do.
Absolutely.
Okay, and with respect to extra costs that might entail, your organization would support providing additional resources so that those tests could be done, and additional staffing and the like.
Of course.
Okay.
But it's not clear to me that the CBP doesn't have the resources now to start immediately stepping up enforcement activity.
Well, I did see in one of the statements that they sent in to us that they had done a little bit more in the way of inspection than I had assumed. Since the UFLPA went into effect through May 29, 2023, CBP stopped more than 4,000 shipments of goods valued at over $1.3 billion for enforcement action review. Now, I know that's just a drop in the bucket, but 4,000 shipments is still, it's not like they're just sitting there eating lunch every day, right?
Just to put it in context, 72% of the apparel coming in from China that's cotton contains Xinjiang cotton.
I don't disagree with that stat, but but what I'm trying to get at, though, is in order to check the other 72%, it's going to take additional resources. They're going to need more people and more ability to do it.
If CBP needs additional resources, they
You'd
need to
support
tell
it.
you. Yeah, of course, I support
Okay.
it. But I also want to make sure that right now we're bleeding. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to stop the bleeding by using resources already appropriated in order to address that. And if they need more resources, we'll be the first to support that, first in line, and we'll advocate for that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Mr. Ezell for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate the importance of this hearing. And it's clear we must ensure the U.S. Customs and Border Protection has the tools necessary to combat this forced labor. We have discussed how the Chinese Communist Party is sending the Uyghur population into slave labor, undermining industries across the world. This subjection of the Uyghurs has been clearly declared genocide by both the Trump and the Biden administration. Today, I want to start by focusing on the slave labor practice by the CCP that manipulates the markets in the seafood industry. Reports have shown the CCP has been using the slave labor practices on fishing vessels and at seafood processing plants. These forced labor practices have allowed the CCP to flood the global market with foreign-raised shrimp. This places a massive financial burden on American shrimpers, including those in South Mississippi where I live. Mr. Stumo, I believe one way the U.S. can create a fair market for our domestic producers is to stop importing goods that are produced through forced slave labor. Since I think we can all agree on that, can you describe how the CCP uses loopholes to get our laws that should stop products that are involved with this slave labor?
Yes, sir. How the shrimp gets into the U.S. is a good example of the challenges the government faces in responding to the Uyghur forced labor. Wild-caught Argentine shrimp could be, shipped to a factory in Shandong province for processing by Uyghur forced labor before being sent here. There is a problem with manifest transparency. Bills of ladings for open ocean freight are public. As was said, truck and rail is not, air is not. This committee or the Congress should be making all manifests public and should require further supply chain and transparency, shift the burden to prove you have the right to enter our country because you are compliant with our laws, shift it to the importer. That would be important. And also, I would say that with regard to Mr. Ivey's questions and yours, even before the UFLPA, we had 19 USC 1307, which is the original law preventing forced labor goods from coming in, and the Customs has used it at times. And in 2018, we had a WRO, withhold release order, against one entity in China for forced labor goods, but then they did another one for all of Turkmenistan, a countrywide WRO. And what should happen, and unfortunately the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act didn't go countrywide with China, it went region-wide, which is very difficult to find out what region in China for customs. You do a full countrywide and then you provide exemptions. So if you have what should happen is if we've got cotton and cotton products, countrywide restriction, and then let them demonstrate that they are compliant. But you only get in if you're compliant. The whack-a-mole of entity by entity, laudable, but it's much more labor intensive.
Thank you. How did practices such as the state-run labor transfer programs used by the Chinese make enforcement more difficult here in the U.S.?
Well, of course, Uyghur forced labor is beyond Xinjiang. It's all over the country. It's state, as opposed to other forced labor findings by the Department of Labor, which find this company or this sector. It clearly comes from Beijing. It's a state program in Beijing. It's state-sponsored genocide rather than sort of somebody in the country doing it. And so China doesn't let people do business due diligence. They don't let people come into the country to inspect. It's a black box, and if you try to pierce that black box, you'll be prosecuted or disappeared. Mm-hmm. So you have to have a presumption that it can't come in once you find that this sector is a problem, and then they have to prove, any importer has to prove that it can.
Well, I'll tell you, I have been in contact with, and I'm just about out of time, with so many of the shrimpers on the Mississippi Gulf Coast that are just, they're going out of business. And it's a tragedy because, we got such wonderful seafood down there on the coast, and it's just really hurting our hometown shrimpers. So, we need to, as the Congress, and as much as information as we can get, to put a stop to some of this. So, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Mr. Tanadar for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop. Appreciate this hearing, and thank you for all of you to be here. With the huge volume of goods that come into this country every day, and more each year, CBP faces a real challenge in keeping goods made with forced labor out of this country. Democrats have supported CBP by investing in people. In fiscal 2023, Congress and President Biden provided the resources for CBP to increase the number of personnel enforcing the Uyghur Act by more than 250 staff. But in addition to people, CBP requires technological solutions. CBP already uses the Advanced Trade Analytics platform to collaborate and share information on shipments that are at risk for potentially violating import laws. Now, I ran testing labs for 25 years, so I understand the technology behind the isotope testing, and it is something that well within the reach. They need the equipment, they need the personnel trained, and it's an easy test to do, and CBP should be able to do that. So this platform has identified a weekly average of 162,000 of these types of high-risk shipments at an estimated value of 51 million per week, but more needs to be done. My question to you, Ms. Glass, is what can Congress do to support CBP's investments in technology to help map supply chains and inform risk-based, intelligence-driven enforcement of the Uyghur?
It's an excellent question. First, according to the Reuters report that published a FOIA request, it was reported that CBP is working with one isotopic testing company. I think the first question is, why are you only working with one?
Sure.
And are you not, why can't you purchase isotopic testing equipment yourself to do this internally? Because a lot of these private companies have personal relationships with other companies like Shein and whatnot. So what's the conflict of interest? What is limiting CBP's ability to use isotopic testing? Our industry just briefed certain agents who are in the field at the ports. They weren't even aware isotopic testing existed or their ability to utilize it. They didn't know that's a problem they should be looking for. So the basic training among CBP officials, it makes no sense to our industry that all this money was set aside by Congress for enforcement activities, but we've seen substantial enforcement activities go down first. It's anemic for UFLPA. I aspire one day to be the electronics industry, and I'm glad we're stopping those products, but they had at least 1.5 billion dollars worth of products detained. We had 39 million. So really figuring out from CBP, okay, what is limiting you? Asking the industry, asking folks like the National Cotton Council, hey, you represent American cotton farmers. Can you partner with CBP on testing to make sure, are there other private entities who, because that would provide opportunities for our US cotton farmers. How can we partner more effectively with CBP to get them the technology that they need? And also, are we testing these products at retail? Are we taking products in a 40-mile radius, going to 200 retailers and taking these products off the shelf and testing them? When I've asked CBP this question, they're not sure they have the authority to do that. I'm trying to figure out the statute to figure out why they wouldn't have the authority to do that. So we need to get a lot more aggressive, and it would not take a lot of time for someone to run around to a few stores with the additional personnel that they have to figure out, okay, let's make sure we're keeping everybody honest. So I'd love to see much more aggressive posture in that. And thank you. It's so wonderful that you have this background on testing.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your answers, Mr. Chair. Chairman Bishop, my time is up, so I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Tandor. The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Mr. Strong for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop. Ms. Glass, in your testimony, you mentioned the impact that increasing shipments have had on domestic manufacturers. Can you talk more about this and specifically the impact that you have seen in our textile industry like cotton farmers in Alabama?
This has had, thank you for the question. This has hurt the entire supply chain, and it has helped superpower cotton production in China. We have a real opportunity here to help farmers in states like Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, and whatnot gain more market share if we're sourcing more domestically and here at home. But right now, because we're allowing these products to come in through de minimis, we're not doing inspections like we should for UFLPA. It's signaling to the Chinese and others in the world that are trade predators, it's okay to flood our marketplace. And know what happens? We end up shutting plants in Alabama and in Virginia, in some of the most competitive plants in the world. Every morning, I get a text about some crisis happening in our industry. They are so pleased this committee's having a hearing because there hasn't been a committee that we're aware of who have actually brought these issues before on customs enforcement. We need to be doing this regularly in order to ask these officials, A, what do you need, and B, what's deterring you right now? So please know, we want to be an active partner with you. And on de minimis, If the committee could amplify with the administration right now, please use your authorities under rulemaking on de minimis. You could divorce, literally overnight, all e-commerce shipments from receiving de minimis. Doesn't mean you can't be online and ordering a product, but guess what, guys? We're not gonna reward the Chinese, we're not gonna reward the CCP, and we're not gonna reward the rest of the world by allowing for unexamined packages coming in duty-free, putting us out of business.
Thank you, Ms. Glass. Furthermore, China is a major supplier of textile yarns and fabrics to other countries that manufacture finished products for export to the U.S. market. What enforcement tools can CBP deploy to determine the origin of textile inputs sent to third countries for manufacturing and prevent illegal transshipments?
CBP could use a lot more of its isotopic testing authorities. They could be, again, going to retail, pulling products from the shelf with labels that say made in Vietnam, made in Indonesia, testing where that cotton comes from. There's a lot of deterrence that can happen that would easily change the trajectory literally overnight. I'm looking for a lot more stepped up enforcement activities. I think we need an all-out response that's aggressive to help stop the bleeding and to help stop China hiding its cotton through the entire marketplace right now. Production's going up. They have 25% or more unemployment amongst their youth. They're propping up their industry, subsidizing them, and they're using illegal forced labor to gain market share, putting our manufacturers out of business and wiping out our tax bases.
That's correct. Ms. Glass, a significant percentage of the textile and apparel imports come from Central and South America, countries with whom we've established a variety of free trade agreements. Those agreements require firms to show that the production of textiles and finished goods must be conducted in the region to obtain duty-free benefits. How is this system being bypassed or absurd to allow forced labor products, cotton, to enter the United States?
We're starting to see more Xinjiang cotton coming in from the region. We just had the first detention of products coming in from Nicaragua that were detained under suspect of violation. We're now seeing, if you look at the trade data, billions of yarns and fabrics coming from China and Asia through the region, yet some of this is claiming that it's made in the region and made in the US. That undermines our industry. It undermines all their investments. But why is customs enforcement in our free trade agreement countries substantially gone down since 2018? And we are noted by Congress as a priority sector. Why are we a priority? Essentially 40% of the duties are collected on our industry. So people want to cheat the system. We can't allow people to bypass the rules under our free trade agreements to erode our industries and industries of our partner countries, and that's why we need immediate help.
Thank you. Chairman Bishop, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Ms. Ramirez for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. I like how you said the last name. Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. And Ranking Member Ivey. This hearing was presented to us as a bipartisan opportunity to discuss bipartisan law. However, I don't think that the Coalition for a Prosperous America can really be a voice in bipartisan conversation, and here's why. The chairman of the coalition, Zach Motto, he's a resident of Burridge, Illinois. I'm from Illinois, just a few minutes from my district, actually. So I know of him. The chairman is a vaccine-denying, anti-abortion, right-wing activist who called President Joe Biden, the president who signed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, China Joe. Mr. Motto and his organization are not fit to advise Congress on trade policy or human rights policy, just as he was not fit to be a trustee or acting mayor of the village of Burridge, Illinois. You see, in 2019, when Mr. Motto was acting mayor of Burridge, 3 Burridge village officials called for Mr. Motto to step down, saying he had politicized the position in violation of a promise. The village board also censured Mr. Motto as a trustee 5 times and called for his resignation multiple times. I don't believe, and I know we've been in this hearing now for a little bit over an hour, that if Mr. Motto is not good enough to serve the people of Burridge, that we should be hearing from someone that directly works under Mr. Amaro. So with that on the record, I would like to pivot and ask questions to the other witnesses. For Ms.
May I actually respond, please?
I don't have a question, and I have a limited amount of
We've
time.
been in business since 2007.
I'm reclaiming my time. I'm
And,
reclaiming my time.
we have
I'm
a
reclaiming my
bipartisan
time,
board.
and I'm
Mr.
reclaiming my
Mr.
time.
Stuma, the time belongs to the member. If
Thank
another
you.
member decides to give you time, we may have a second round of questioning, we'll see, but the timing belongs to the member.
Thank you so much. For Ms. Grieva, we've spoken a lot about goods made with forced labor in Xinjiang specifically, but the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act also covers goods made outside of the area if there's evidence that workers have been transferred to other parts of China for forced labor or under coercive conditions. So let me ask you, to what extent should importers be paying attention to their supply chains that originate from other parts of China that may involve forced labor forced upon the Uyghur population?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. Our coalition, the Coalition End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region, has been calling since July 2020 for every corporation to know their global supply chain. And this law makes that a legal obligation. If your imported product is detained for examination, you have to show CBP that you have a complete supply chain tracing. Certainly, the number of industries are using Uyghur forced labor outside of the Uyghur region, and certainly any company that has a, quote, most companies, zero tolerance for forced labor. And if they say that, they need to know their supply chain.
Thank you. So I have just one more question. And Mr. Mathis, Ms. Glass, or Ms. Grieva, you can answer this. Knowing that importing goods made with forced labor has long been prohibited, and Congress has strengthened CBP's ability to stop goods from Xinjiang made with forced labor from coming into the U.S., what are you seeing other countries doing to reduce some of that forced labor goods from entering the markets? And then how should the U.S. be working to ensure that that's happening? Any other three of you? We have about a minute.
Just quickly, not every country has a ban on forced labor products, okay, unfortunately, even including cotton. So our government, on a diplomatic level at the State Department and some of our agencies, needs to be working with the other governments to more effectively enforce this. And to Ranking Member Ivy's question related to the Congo, we are seeing the Chinese take advantage of other countries in trying to illegally transship or invest in assets that make it almost impossible under the BRI initiative that help perpetuate the use of forced labor on the ground or facilitate forced labor products. Our State Department should be taking a lead role along with CBP to help deter this trade, and we need to be working with the international community.
Thank you. Mr. Mathis?
Quickly, the European Parliament is considering a form of legislation to mirror in some ways the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, but primarily to deal with forced labor generally, internationally. But it's been very clear in the public releases from the European Parliament that this is primarily directed at the PRC, that this is their major concern. And so I think for you as members of Congress, in meeting with your European counterparts, particularly those in the European Parliament, this is something that you can do to support U.S. diplomacy and the effort to enforce.
Thank you. My time is up, and so I'll yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back, and I think the question is whether, at the discretion of the chair with the concurrence of the ranking member, I think we'll proceed to a second round of questions.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman.
All right, and with that, and Mr. Stumo, I think if you want to have an opportunity to respond to that, I'll yield you some time. I will say this hearing has been extraordinarily bipartisan, and there's been a commonality in the witnesses and the members in terms of digging into the issue, but I will yield you 30 seconds or so if you wish to address the matters that were raised by Ms. Ramirez.
Yeah, we're very bipartisan. We have very strong Democratic members who have been big supporters of Democrats. We have strong Republican members, and they all have very strong feelings for their party and on other issues. But trade and forced labor doesn't cut cleanly across party lines. It's a very strong issue for our country, for our employment, and while there's a ton of partisan issues out there, this isn't one of them, and I'm proud to be working on this issue, which I can work with people like Earl Blumenauer, Chairman Jason Smith, Sherrod Brown, Marco Rubio, et cetera. And in fact, on de minimis, we do have 3 bipartisan bills that this committee may want to look at, from Ranking Member Blumenauer and Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, joined by Neil Dunn, Sherrod Brown, joined by Marco Rubio in the Senate, and Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, joined by Tammy Baldwin and J.D. Vance. So,
Thank you, sir. And I appreciate the point. I think the point's well made. Mr. Mattis, I want to direct to you maybe, because I didn't hear you addressing the question of, you talked a little bit about FLETF and its and the presumptions built in and so forth, the way it operates, the way maybe it ought to be changed. I'm hearing about the de minimis exception and ways it ought to be. It seems to be a mockery of its own name to be because it's been a billion packages. You can see why you couldn't set up a regulatory interdiction there that would work. This point that Ms. Glass has made, and this article seems to make, that CBP spent about $1 million doing isotopic testing. I noted Mr. Tanadar's comment that it's easy testing to do. I'm mystified, and I know perhaps we need to ask CBP, but why would there not be more resources devoted to doing that? Do you have any insight on that, given your policy expertise?
Frankly, I'm not sure why more hasn't been done. I know that when the process began of drafting this piece of legislation and working it through and getting technical assistance, there were something like 30 billets at CBP that were not all full-time employees, but it added up to 30 full-time employees that were devoted to forced labor enforcement investigations at CBP headquarters. And that was simply too small, too few, and not enough resources. So I think one of the things that I've seen, at least in my experience in government, was that when you provide a bunch of money or you provide a bunch of resources, when you have such a small existing capacity, it takes time to build out. And that's kind of a funnel that things are being forced through. And I think over time, I think we could all agree that CBP has not moved fast enough, or we would like it to have moved more. The direction has been in the right way. We just haven't seen it move at the speed and scale that it should be.
Anything to add to that, Ms. Grieva?
I would note that it's quite important to maintain the level of funding. We heard that the $70 million addition in fiscal 23 may not be maintained in 24, and that would be a real blow backwards. It takes time to cost out these contracts, as you know, in government, and to then suddenly drop the number will completely stop this momentum.
Yeah, I hear that. I do wonder what became of the $70 million and how it was used, and I think we need to ask. Mr. Stumo, do you want to add something?
I would just add one thing. I mentioned before when Mr. Ivey was out that the withhold release orders with authority under Section 307 or 19 U.S.C. 1307, you can do a ban on products like we did with Turkmenistan, all products in the sensitive or the problematic industry, and then give waivers for those that prove that they're compliant. And that's a model that could potentially be used for China. Ban, WRO equivalent against everything, and then you prove that you're compliant with your own isotopic testing or whatever.
Ms. Glass, I'll give you the last 30 seconds to just address any topic you want to at further length, including the one that's being discussed.
I would just say we always have to be mindful of the loopholes that we create, right? What are we trying to get at in terms of addressing some of these issues, and then what are the unintended consequences, right? Because nobody labels their product as a forced labor product into the United States. If we end up banning a particular product, guess what? Instead of it being T-shirts, it's going to be an auto part. No one's labeling this is a direct mail shipment for Kim Glass for fentanyl. I mean, we have got to be mindful that people are looking to game the system. So what do we have to do? We have to make sure that we are enforcing and thinking ahead, okay, what are the unintended loopholes? And that's what you need to ask CBP, okay? Why haven't you moved forward with rulemaking process to stop de minimis? What are you doing? And also, what's limiting you? And Ranking Member Ivey, if there's some limitations, we'll support it, but at least come to us. And our industry can also be a resource on some of the technologies. We want to be asked. We want to be an active partner in this because this trade is killing us.
My time's expired. Thank you, Ms. Glass. I'll yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll pick up where you left off along the point you were just making. But it appears to me that there are quarterly briefing requirements, I think, by the statute. So, and there's multiple committees that have jurisdiction over this. So it may be they're briefing other committees and not us, or, but that may be an opportunity for us to have more input from not only your industry, but others. The electronics industries that we were talking about a few minutes ago. I'd love to hear more from them as well. With respect to withhold release orders, that's in the statute. So they have the authority to do that if I'm reading this correctly. But I did want to ask this. I've got an article here that talks about U.S. targets 2 China-based firms over forced labor practices. Looks like a DHS press release, but it's the Camel Group, a battery manufacturer, and Chung Wang Biotech Group, a spice and extract manufacturer. So there's 2 prosecutors, and this is dated August 2, 2023. So there's 2 moving forward. Just gotten started. Are you familiar with these at all? No. Okay. Well, that's fine. But it does go to another issue that was raised a few minutes ago, I think, which was, why aren't they doing more of these? Why aren't they putting more businesses on the entity list? And I think what I'll have to ask, and you all might not be the group, maybe we've got to go back to CBP to figure it out, but what I'm told is one of the concerns is that because it's a new regulatory regime, they're worried about if you start putting businesses on there and you start losing these, you create a precedent moving forward that would be negative. So apparently you're trying to set up the better possible cases. Having said that, I think I take your point, Ms. Glass, you need assistance now. This is a challenge. It's tough on your industry and also on obviously the people, Ms. Grave, who are suffering at the other end of this supply line. I want to ask this question too before I run out of time. The Congo issue, Democratic Republic of Congo, and this is the rechargeable batteries. This is an article from NPR. It's Terry Gross, How Modern Day Slavery in the Congo Powers the Rechargeable Battery Economy.
Gentleman, like to submit it for the record?
I would.
Without objections to order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But basically what it does is it walks through how things are operating in the DRC with respect to these slave-like conditions for cobalt reserve mines. These are artisanal miners, so to speak, but basically people who are working with hand tools. They don't get protection from toxic cobalt dust, which is generated when you're mining it. As we mentioned earlier, Mr. Chairman, I think you pointed it out, some of the people who are doing this mining are as young as 6-year-olds. I think 40% of the people doing the mining are children. These are mines that are in Africa, but many of them are owned by China. And there's cross-contamination, or at least that's the issue that's been raised with respect to cobalt that's come from these kinds of mines as opposed to the proper supply chain mines. My understanding is that the businesses who are using the cobalt products, and many of them are some of the top electronics companies here in the world, are supposed to be keeping their supply chains clean, so to speak. But I'm not clear on whether that's working, and some of these articles are raising the possibility that it doesn't. I wanted to get a sense of, and I know you're textiles, not minerals, but to the extent you have an understanding of how we can get the government some assistance from the private sector that's shipping these materials to provide not only transparency, but some monitoring of their own so that we don't have to have CBP do all the heavy lifting. There's paperwork that would be generated. And then back to the point that was made earlier, I guess by me, if we have, I think, stiffer enforcement penalties than what we've discussed today, it creates an incentive for these businesses to, if I'm understanding this right. So for example, the clothes made in Vietnam that you've discussed, and it's company X that does the final sewing work and then ships them over. Well, if we find out that that shipment through the testing came from that region of China that's providing forced labor, what do we do about it? I mean, if we just have them ship it back to another country and they don't get as much as they would there as they would in the United States, but so what? They're still making some money. And meanwhile, more of this material's coming through. So not only is there no downside to getting caught, or a minimal downside, they're still benefiting from all the materials that are coming, whether it's electronics or textiles. It seems to me that that's insufficient, that if we have to put in all of that work to find these and put all the testing and the resources and the like, when we find them, I think there have to be some kind of sufficient sanctions in order to send the message back that it's important for you to police your own supply lines and the, you know, so that you're protecting your business, create an incentive for the business to do it as well. And I see everyone way over my time, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence.
So done, Mr. Ranking Member. I appreciate you yielding back, and I yield to the gentleman, Minister Ezell, for 5 minutes of additional questioning.
I wish I could speak like Mr. Ivey. I tell you, it's I could just sit here and listen to him talk, and it seemed like the clock goes slow on him and fast on me. So it's probably I
You
enjoy
think fast, though, right, sir?
I do, yeah. I think fast. I just can't get it out. So anyway, and this is a good environment today. So I'm very glad to have a calm environment here today, and we can all go forward here. So, Mr. Mattis, we know the solar installations are expanding here in the United States. In my district, there are at least 10 completed or approved utility-scale solar projects. I want Mississippians to be confident these solar panels are not enriching the CCP and contributing to this terrible slave labor genocide. Unfortunately, we already have examples where the CBP has failed to stop solar companies with connections to forced labor in China. This, again, like the shrimping issue I just discussed earlier, should be prevented under our current laws. What more can the CBP do to target foreign materials from China that are used in solar cells?
In this case, I think it's a question of simply recognizing that if it's polysilicon and it's coming out of the PRC, then it almost certainly should be subject to an enforcement action, because so much of the polysilicon products and processing, all the way up through certain pieces of the solar panel and up to almost a complete product, will have some connection to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And it is about goods that are produced wholly in our part, or goods that use materials that come from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region that should be subject to that seizure and prevented from entering into the United States. So I think that this is one of those priority areas where if you have a PRC connection, if the polysilicon is sourced from the PRC or other parts of it, that it should be on the high priority list. And I would just point out that there were a number of industry conversations that took place that were not supportive, shall we say, of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the process. There were a handful of American solar companies, though, that were the ones that were among the most supportive, because they recognized the cost that they were facing. And when we look, if we're looking at a problem like this, broadly speaking about the PRC's predatory economic practices, if we think that there's a market-based solution for non-market problems, we're going to keep doing the wrong thing to address this. This is a little bit like preparing for a football game and thinking that more time in the gym and more time on the practice field you're going to win when someone is coming along with a crowbar and going to break your knee.
Yeah.
Right? Doesn't matter how much you did on the other things if someone's going to break your knee. And I think one of the points of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and other trade actions, like withhold release orders that could be used, is that this is about protecting sort of the knee of American industry so that it can actually take the field, whether it's level or not.
Am I the only one that thought of Tanya Harding when you said that? My goodness. I apologize.
No. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I actually would, if you wouldn't mind, I'd
Yeah,
like
go
to
ahead.
address that. We are involved with this quite a bit. With solar, we've been building back U.S. solar quite a bit, starting with President Trump's tariffs, 201 tariffs on solar, which got a lot more building going on. And then the Inflation Reduction Act with its production tax credits last year So you have both the tariff side and then the 301 tariffs on top of it, but then providing incentives to build here. And I know from a lot of solar companies, we have just a construction super cycle in solar going on here. Unfortunately, so both a Republican initiative and a Dem initiative we supported there. China then tried to, in this sort of trade, which is just the smuggler's anarchy of transshipment and circumvention, they sent it through Southeast Asia. And Commerce found that China was circumventing through Southeast Asia. The administration declared a climate emergency and declared a moratorium on tariffs through Southeast Asia for that climate emergency, which we disagreed with. And the Congress, by a majority, voted to reverse that, but not veto-proof. Right now, we've got a lot of solar going on. We do have the Chinese with their low-value currency and their crisis at home that's really subsidizing and sending as much. The solar volume here is really big. So we have to, on one hand, put tariffs up, and on the other hand, subsidize. And the tariffs can pay for the subsidies in any industry. But that's something we've seen that it does work.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank all of you, all the witnesses, for your valuable testimony. Thank you to the members. I think this has been a very interesting and useful hearing, and I see lots of opportunities for bipartisan follow-up to this hearing. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you. We would ask the witnesses to respond to those in writing if received. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.